On Sunday, this last Sunday, we talked about Christmas trees, because I'm trying to do things that you will remember. Tonight, I'd like to talk about Christmas lights. I want to talk about being the bright lights of heaven, just for a few minutes with you, and to really understand what's going on with in the Word and a reflection that we can come and we can worship with tonight. I would say most of our family, and then the time when I was in junior high and high school, we moved to the state of Arizona, and that's where our families are, and that's where I met my wife, who's playing at the piano tonight, and that's where we married, and then I rescued her out of there because it gets hot, okay? Right now, it's actually quite beautiful, and one of the traditions at Christmas time there in Arizona is to be able to go to all over the valley, Phoenix Valley, and really see light displays where there are many, many homes. They kind of coordinate together, streets, neighborhoods, to do this. And sometimes the line of cars to get into these streets to see the lights it can be almost a mile long, depending on how good this light display is. I decided to grab some pictures of some of the houses and what it might look like, just to show you. This is but you have to imagine there's a whole street like this. When you get on the street, it's basically from space they can see these lights and the Las Vegas Strip, the two, because there's just so many lights going on and taking place. Here's another couple lights of just absolute craziness, really, literally. And then out there's one at the lake, and that's right by my parents' home. So I've seen that, been there. It's just enchanting. Now, there are a couple reasons why this tradition works so well out there. Number one, because it's beautiful at Christmas time in Arizona. It's warmer, and so people can go outside and light jacket or a sweater and go out and enjoy all these lights through the evening time. They don't change the time zone there too, so it generally stays light and then goes into the sunset that way, and the sunsets are beautiful during that time. The second reason that this is such a tradition is because they're not paying the Italian electricity bills from Enel. Okay, so Salt River Project there, it has lower electricity bills, okay? So that's another major reason that people go crazy. I think a third reason is just because, well, it's kind of in our culture, isn't it, that one street has to kind of one-up the next street and have a little bit of competition. And every year, it just seems like they just keep increasing lights and lights and lights again. And so this is a neat tradition and everything, but in a way back in the time of the prophet Isaiah, and in our church right now, we're reading through as a community, we're reading through this prophet Isaiah because he's featured so much in what he proclaimed, what God gave him 720 some years before Jesus was actually born. He figures so much into the nativity time. He figures so much into the time of Israel. And Isaiah, he was talking about a time when Israel should be full of lights and glory and beautiful, and should be the lights that are attracted in the nation. Out here, some of you, when you're driving down, for example, the mountain highway out on the out by the mountains there, and you look up and you can see actually on a clear night, almost down to the seaside, you can look up and see our mountainside, and you see that little tiny village of Mezzomonte. Mezzomonte means half mountain, halfway up. And there's really only two people up there that live there, and they're just lighting stuff up at night. But you can see that for miles, hundreds of kilometers on a clear night, right there, just sparkling on that hillside. So a little light in a very dark place goes a very long way. So when we're reading Isaiah, he talks about light. He talks about physical light, but more than physical light, he talks about spiritual light. And basically, Isaiah's contrast is that physical light will help us to understand the deeper principles, the truer principles of spiritual light. For example, people in darkness don't move around. Well, they sit. They're stationary. They sleep if they're in darkness. Maybe they're lost. Or maybe they're not alive if they're in darkness. So the corresponding principle is spiritual light. And spiritual light means to have divine light or divine connection with God. To have divine light inside of you means that you have had some kind of transformation. It's a transformative light, the kind of light that causes you from once ignoring God, not caring what he actually thought about your life and what you did and your dreams, your hopes, or anything, to actually loving God and pursuing God. To light up, if you will, in courage and passion for God, even in the face of adversity. In another way, spiritual light is literally to sparkle like a bride on her wedding day in the middle of the noonday sun. So when we speak of light tonight, we are talking this evening about spiritual reality. We're talking about true hope. We're talking about deeper things that cannot be seen by people really who only live for the here and now. If you're a person that grew up living for the here and now, and Christmas is all about the here and now and kind of generating up that seasonal feeling, you'll miss out on the deeper principles of the light that the Bible offers and also that God offers. If you're seeking to live the dream, whatever that dream is and whatever you've invented it to be, well, you will miss the light or the deeper principle of light, spiritual light, because you're consuming life and you're wasting life rather than seeing the purpose of life. And so, back in the day of Isaiah, Israel's light was fading. It was dimming. Isaiah was calling out passage after passage into the dark hearts of Israel. And he was saying, your light is almost out. Sin and fear and perversion have suffocated the glory, the heavy glory, the light and truth of Yahweh. Israel, Isaiah cries, needs a new light. And the world needs a new light in Israel, so the world can come and see the new light from God. So we begin in our passage way back in Isaiah 8:22. And Isaiah says, and they will look to the earth, but behold distress and darkness. This is Israel, the people of Israel. They'll look for, if you will, prosperity. They will look for crops. They will look for food. They will look for sustenance. They will look for hope of what would be growing, and they won't see it. It will be darkness. They will have gloom, and there will be anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. Why does Isaiah prophesy so hardly and so harshly, if you will? I think part of it is because Israel, who had seen the light of God and had experienced God's divine presence in their central city, in their midst, Israel had ignored him and was ignoring him for years. Their light was dimming more and more. They were being thrust into thick darkness because God was calling out to them. God had been, if you will, pursuing them for years, sending them prophets like Isaiah, and they wouldn't respond. But chapter 9 starts the hope. It's a hope passage. Look at verse 1. But there will be, now, when God works, there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. And then here comes the next promise. So he specifies where this light would come. And then he says in verse 2, the people who walked in darkness there have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, of them that light has, or upon them that light has shone. Where will the light come? Well, I'll just go back to the verse there. It will come in a place called Zebulun and a place called Naphtali. And when we read those, we don't necessarily, if we don't know our geography or a little bit of our history, it's really hard to understand what's being said here. You see, Zebulun and Naphtali were the northern and northeasternmost tribes of Israel. The two kingdoms of Israel, actually the one kingdom divided into two parts, south and north. The northern was more rebellious than the southern kingdom. And the northern kingdom was under great threat because Assyria and Sennacherib and Tiglath-Pileser was coming. If you've ever heard of those names in history. And their threat was ferocious. And of course, they did come, and the northern kingdom fell, and Zebulun and Naphtali were the very first tribes to fall. They were the marginalized ones. They were the outsiders. They were the farthest out. They were the wild tribes. They were the ones who had, let's say, compromised the most. And so when we get to this passage, Isaiah says, even to the tribes of Israel, this light will shine, but it will shine even to the extremities of Israel. To the ones that everybody counted out, God will do wondrous works. He will shine his divine presence. And he will be in the land by the sea. That sea is the Sea of Galilee. I was just there at this time last year. It's a big sea. And at the top would have been Zebulun. And in the middle, or on the southern parts, would have been Naphtali. And on the other side on the east side, where Jordan today is, the country, would have been the Decapolis, or 10 Gentile cities. And they also would receive this light. And then the Jordan descends down. And by the way, the word Jordan actually means descending. There's a whole story going on in the names. There would be an exalted one who would wrestle himself down into our world, and then he would do it by descending into birth, even through these names. That's where the light will come from. That's where he will shine. The kind of light here is mentioned here in verse 2. It's a great light. Notice there in the second line. They have seen a great light. And in Hebrew, what's special about this is this reminds us of the first light of creation. God said, let there be light. But in Hebrew, it's in the past tense. In other words, we could say it this way. There has been light. Let it be seen. What is that great light? There has been a great light. What is that? That is the Creator speaking forth and being seen into creation. The Creator is the same one who would be the light to come. And he creates physical light. It is seen and shown at creation, and then he comes into our world to make a new creation, and he himself will be seen and will be shown. And that's what Isaiah is alluding to. And he's pointing, one day, this is all going to converge. One day, this is all going to be united together in one place, the place of Galilee, the farthest ones away. But the people of Israel at the time of Isaiah, they're not listening to Isaiah. They are too concerned with their wealth. They're too concerned with their modern day crises that were going on. And therefore, because they're not listening to Isaiah, they're not listening also to God. People today, well, we're not all that much different, are we? It's very easy to forget God's word when there's times of crises and when we're really all trying to stay above water or get ahead. So Isaiah picks up the theme again. He doesn't just leave it there and says, oh, there's one prophecy. He wants them to understand more about what the light looks like when it comes. Later in his book, he starts to talk about the day of Messiah. It will be a day of light. But this time, later in the book, he says the Messiah is also going to be called the suffering servant. There will be one who will be a Messiah, but he will have to suffer, which was so strange to the ears of Israel. Why would our greatest king have to suffer? But Isaiah lays that out for us later in his book. When he picks up light again, he picks it up in chapter 58. He says, if you pour yourself out for the hungry, and then you satisfy the desire of the afflicted, well, then shall your light rise in the darkness, and your gloom, well, that will be like the noonday. Everything will transform. What is he getting at? What does light look like in this chapter? In Isaiah 58, it's about true worship, proper worship. They were just doing rituals and traditions on holidays. And so God is pointing out, hey, you're doing these traditions, but the traditions aren't transforming you. We don't have a divine connection. Your heart and my heart aren't open because look at the way that you're living the rest of the year. How will you know if true light is in you? Well, it's here in the verse. If you serve the needy, if you pour yourself out for the hungry, if you do righteousness that pleases the Lord, that loves those who are struggling in difficulty and are afflicted, if you do justice for the afflicted, That shows that we have a divine light, that I am there in your community. And that's important because he's saying, in the day of Messiah, this is what people will do. Messiah's people will pour themselves out for the needy and the afflicted. In the very next chapter, he says there's another aspect to what light looks like. It's in chapter 59 and verse 9. Therefore, justice is far from us, and righteousness does not overtake us. We hope for light, and behold, darkness. We hope for brightness, but we walk in gloom. So what's happening there that that Isaiah is calling out and crying out? He's saying that among God's people, we should practice justice. We should see goodness and righteousness done in our society for each other. Our courts should be true to the law, if you will. Our practices, our ethics, our business, our pursuits should be loyal first to God and not just to money and things. But what happens? People were living unjustly. This year we heard a cry in our streets and in our courts for justice. Isaiah cried way back then too. The justice is the kind of justice that pleases the Lord. We hope for that kind of justice. You see, guys, God is saying that spiritual light will take place when people are loved and cared for as God cares for them. That's chapter 58. In chapter 59, he goes on with this passage and he says, Yahweh, God, promises and threatens to put on his own armor and to go to war for those who are victimized by injustice. Light comes when the divine warrior, who is light and is armed in light, arrives to beat down darkness. Darkness is the enemy. Sin is the enemy. Hatred is the enemy. Violence is the enemy. Stealing and theft and lying, these are the enemies. And this divine warrior will come one day and beat those enemies down in light. The light that comes is the light of Yahweh's judgment. And it comes on a people who practice injustice. And God's judgment will come, and here's what it will do. One day, the divine warrior in his light will come, and he will put the world back together in the right order, the way that he made it as the great light at creation. He will make a new order, a new justice. Isaiah was telling us that. And then the people that follow him will practice godly justice. Well, then Isaiah turns and he says, okay, 58 is the suffering servant caring, saying light will come when we are living and caring for people like God cares for people, when we're worshiping him properly, and out of that comes truth, kindness, love. And then justice and rightness and setting the world and working in the world to reconcile it back to God's divine order. Well, then Isaiah does another turn, and there's this amazing ray, a bright sunlight ray that happens in the very next verse of chapter 60 and verse 1. Here it is. Isaiah cries, Israel, arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Verse 2. For look, or look up, behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples, but the Lord himself will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. His heavy glory will make you resplendent or magnificent. The suffering servant in the chapters before, as Isaiah is saying here in chapter 60, the suffering servant has become their one divine light. One true light. As Israel's light, we know their light faded, and they sat in darkness for 400 years. And then the divine warrior came, but he came in a form that was unexpected. You don't think that there are warrior babies out there, but this one was. great prophet that accompanied Isaiah was named Simeon. And he's a contrast. You can find him in Luke 2. We'll talk about him in just a second. But Simeon, well, Simeon said that this would be a sword, a dividing sword, that many would rise and fall, because this one light would come and divide the darkness with its light. But the cry was to Israel. Take a look. Arise, shine, for your light has come. Who is to arise and shine? Is it God? No, it's the people. It's the people that are to arise. So that one light that would light the world was going to be the call to all the other lights. And that one light would set ablaze many. And so that people could see that there is God's presence. But the only way that they could arise and shine. Now, remember, they were sitting in darkness, Isaiah said before. But now he's calling them, stand up. Ablaze, be ablaze. Let there be glory in you. Why? Because you are recognizing that your light has come. So back in Isaiah 9, he says, you have seen a great light. But God doesn't want you just to see a great light. He wants you also to become great lights. All after the one true great light. You see, he didn't say, arise and reflect the great light. He said, arise and you shine. But how do you do that? Well, the great light himself must be in you. That's the connection. That's that spiritual dwelling. God must live in a life and transform that life to care for those who are afflicted, to do justice, to love God passionately in true worship. That's divine light. So arise and shine. Passionately pursue God through the one light that has shown you the way. That light, as Isaiah continues on in the prophecies, as well as other prophets, was not just a candle, but would become the sunrise. For that light would dawn on the entire world. And then later in the same chapter, the word says, the sun shall be no more your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give your light. In other words, you're not going to be walking through religious festivals watching the seasons of the moon and the sun and the trajectory of all these things to try to know me. No, the Lord himself will be your everlasting light. Isaiah is telling him the Lord himself will come and show you the way. You will walk in him, and your God will be your heavy glory. He will shine on you, shine in you, and shine through you. So guys, today, Christmas, the good news is that Christmas is the celebration of the rising of the great light. The one sunrise who rose upon our souls, upon our world, that Isaiah prophesied 722 years before his arrival. And that night, at night, in the darkness, came the candle. And then that candle grew into the sunrise himself. But more than this, the good news is that Christmas is also a commitment to please God and live in that great light. It's not just about seeing and celebrating, oh great, God came to our world. It's also about embracing him fully with a new and renewed humble heart. Open, adoring, worshiping, humble heart, realizing I have no divine presence without the one true Emmanuel, God with us, the one that he promised to send. So the New Testament writers pick up on this theme of light. John, the apostle, writes in the gospel of Jesus, in his gospel, in the beginning was the Word. The message was with God. The message or word of God was God. He, person, was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Way back in the beginning, here is the great light, proclaiming truth that he is God over all. And verse 4 is special. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Not only is he light, he's also life. And so if you're going to really live, if you're really going to come alive, if you're really going to live why you were created by the one who is at the beginning, well, then he must dwell in you, for he is both light and life. And the darkness, verse 5, it's not on the screen, but verse 5 says the darkness tried to overcome it, but could not overcome the light, for the light has overcome the darkness. That is what it means when Jesus came into our world. Jesus is advancing, and so is his truth. In Matthew chapter 4, it says, now when he heard, this is Jesus, that John had been arrested, this is Matthew's gospel, he withdrew into the region of Galilee. And watch this. And he left Nazareth, and he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, same word as we saw in Isaiah, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. So that what was spoken by the prophet, everybody? Isaiah might be fulfilled. Here's the writer. Here's the gospel proclamation. Isaiah said it, and this is the fulfillment of it. Here's the new light. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people that were dwelling there in darkness have seen a great light. And for those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. Isn't that wonderful? Because if you think of it, that is where Jesus set up the first part of his ministry. The Sea of Galilee became a stage for all the miracles, and they got to see the very first powerful actions of God himself in human form. And there in the region of Galilee, around the entire region, Jesus calls his first disciples and performs his first miracles and shows that he is the Messiah, and he unites again the northern and the southern kingdom. And what a privilege. It wasn't in Jerusalem in the centers of power. It wasn't in the centers of government. It wasn't in the palaces. No, it was in the fishing towns. It was in the marginalized people. It was in the tribes that had been so intermarried and taken over and destroyed that were just trying to get by. Here comes the Son of God who loved the afflicted and cared for those who were lost. And they had the privilege of seeing the great light first. And from that time on, Jesus began there to preach. Jesus himself saying, here's how you have the light. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is right here in your region, as Isaiah said it would come. Then Luke, another gospel writer, we talked about Simeon, the prophet, took Jesus up when he was 8 days old in his arms and blessed God. And he said this, Lord, now you are letting your servant today I can depart in peace because your plan is being fulfilled according to your word, just as you promised. It's happening now. My eyes have seen your salvation, that you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, not just the Jewish people, but all people. What is this presence? A light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel. This is the promise. This is what Simeon gives to us. The understanding of Christmas, the understanding of Christ coming, the advent of Jesus in his first advent is the call that he's going to come back again. But now, today, this is how God is reconciling the world. Friends, I can tell every one of you, the light has dawned in our land. The light has dawned upon people in this very room. The light has risen upon our world. This is God's salvation plan. It's not yet to come. It's not yet to arrive and surprise us. It has come. And God is advancing his kingdom and his salvation and his truth and his reconciliation and his goodness through who? All of the little lights that he's calling to. Arise and shine, for your light has come. Today we can quote and we can sing and we can praise, not guessing at when he might come, but praising God because he has come. This is what Simeon is saying. Now the plan of God of salvation for the world is here. And then John, while you have the light, Jesus said, believe in the light, that you may become sons of light, or the essence of it. So how do you not only see the light, but also become filled with the light? In the verses that we just read, you have to recognize that this is God's plan right now for salvation and for glory. There's no self-salvation plans. There's no self-salvation projects. It is a turning and a surrendering and a bowing first to the humble Christ child, who would be the child king prophesied way back in Isaiah 9, the great light that would come. And in that child king, so you too would rend your heart like faith, like having faith of a child, of a kid. Being willing to trust and say, yes, I see your story. I open my life to that, and I live for that. This is God's plan now. Am I following it? Am I a light too? Am I ablaze with the glory of God? And then in Matthew 12:36, becoming sons of light is what Isaiah was sharing in all those other passages. To believe, to worship, to serve wholeheartedly, to do justice courageously, to live for Him, and to please Him. That's the call of Christmas, to be a light from heaven in a dark world. How can people know that God's kingdom has come? Through you and through us, lights all together.